Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to join this debate that quite ironically started off by the member for Naparima moving his motion, not even understanding his own motion, and facing the indignity of having him be ruled irrelevant on a number of times of his own drafted motion, and it has only deteriorated since then. I'd like to try to raise the level of conversation, Madam Speaker, through you, to really explain as we as citizens examine this phenomenon of crime. There is not a single civic-minded citizen anywhere in the world who is not concerned about crime, criminality, the effects of crime and criminality on their respective countries. Trinidad and Tobago is no different. There is no sensible person that would bury his or her head in the sand and pretend that the difficulties of criminality don't exist in Trinidad and Tobago. The question must become, and the conversation must be one for us as legislators in this House as to what can we do to be part of the solution. Part of the solution and part of the defense against crime, but also how do we respond to crime and what is it that we can do, firstly as elected members of Parliament, members of the legislature, to deal with crime and criminality. And that starts with the passage of legislation. Ironically, and once again, unfortunately, in an attempt to mislead the population, the previous speaker, the member for Superior, took the time in a prepared speech for her to list certain elements of legislation that she said, that the member for Superior said the UNC opposition supported the government over the last 7 years with respect to bills and the passage of legislation to deal with crime. In case the population is misled by that, the vast majority of acts that were referred to by the member for Superior had to be passed. And I remind the population of in 2016, when the country was on the brink of a disaster and a crisis, and we were at the risk of becoming a de-risked sovereign nation. And that is what the vast majority of the legislation that the member for Superior listed that they supported had to be done. Because at the time, the United States of America, had said if that legislation was not passed, and I remind the population that the UNC opposition refused to pass that special majority the first time, pushing us on a brink of crisis. And I asked the leader of the opposition whether either herself or her members had a meeting with the United States Embassy in Trinidad where they were told if the legislation wasn't passed, what would happen to Trinidad and Tobago. And to remind the population, it was the FATCA legislation, and if that was not passed, we would have been de-risked. So they were not supportive of it. The record shows that initially they did not support it, and it is only when the pressure came and the population realized where the UNC had put Trinidad and Tobago that we would become de-risked, which meant parents would not be able to send money for their children at school away. The business community would not be able to pay their US bills away and their suppliers away. Credit cards in Trinidad and Tobago would no longer be allowed to be used by the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Then the UNC caved in and had to support the legislation. To stand here today and list 4 pieces of legislation that they supported that are special majority pieces of legislation in an attempt to mislead the population to say, look, we supported crime-fighting legislation, is wholly incorrect and facetious. Putting that one aside, we as legislators can pass legislation, but today I want to talk about the concept of consequences. Because you see, when I sat in the seat of Minister of National Security, it bothered me on a daily and a nightly basis as to how do we make Trinidad and Tobago safer. And the concept I want to discuss with the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago today is that of consequences. Passage of legislation is only one pillar. So we can sit here as 41 elected members and we could pass certain legislation, anti-gang legislation, a lot of hurrah from the other side is being made about that today. After, again, the record would show that the opposition, the UNC opposition resisted it, allowed it to lapse. The PNM, when in opposition, not only agreed to support anti-gang legislation, but we also agreed to support amendments to the Bail Act to be tacked on to that anti-gang legislation. So it meant that those who were charged under the anti-gang legislation would be kept incarcerated for a specific period of time to allow the police to build out the evidence. The point is, legislation is only one part of the pillar. In my thinking how to make Trinidad and Tobago safer, and there was a reduction of crime during that period, it became very apparent, and this is a conversation I raised time and time again with my cabinet colleagues at cabinet. Trinidad and Tobago is suffering from a lack of consequences for misbehavior, and that is the problem. Legislation is only one pillar. When you examine the criminal justice system, and that is what the conversation should be about, how do we improve the criminal justice system? The concept of separation of powers is thrown at you. But we as the legislators pass law. Our responsibility ends there. It is now for somebody to enforce the law. So as the Minister of National Security, working with the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, I saw numerous examples, including under the anti-gang legislation, of them charging persons. One of my colleagues on the other side, I think it was Barataria Sawa, earlier this week asked, again, a facetious question. Well, how many people have been convicted under the legislation? Knowing fully well that the government has no role to play in the conviction. A conviction, it starts off, we pass the legislation. We do the policy, we provide the resources. The next thing that must happen is that persons, the police service, will charge persons. And that has happened. We've had it, statistics provided here time and time again of how many people have been charged under the anti-gang legislation. It is now scores of persons. Scores of persons have been charged under the anti-gang legislation. So they shift the goalposts. Tell us about convictions. The answer for convictions lies on the prosecutorial arm, the defense arm, but importantly the judiciary. And that is the part of the conversation I would like to take up here today. Because you see, unless there are consequences for corruption, unless there are consequences for criminal behavior where people feel the consequences of their wrongdoing, my submission is it will make very little difference. And that is an area that unfortunately, it's very frustrating in government. You don't have much control over. How do you secure the convictions? So, what we have done as an administration, and it has been going on now for years, one of the things in adjusting the criminal justice system, get rid of preliminary inquiries. How many times have we been here in debate to try and abolish preliminary inquiries? And the goalpost is always moving for the abolition of preliminary inquiries. And I heard the most absurd submission when I was participating in those discussions once by defense attorneys. Well, if you get rid of preliminary inquiries, the young attorneys would have no opportunity at magistrates' court to earn a fee on brief and to get experience. So people with an agenda prevent the abolition of preliminary inquiries to do what? To earn fees and to frustrate the system. That is the criminal justice system. Recently, as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, as an elected member for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, a constituency that has, unfortunately in it, some criminal elements, but the vast majority law-abiding citizens who are affected by that handful, that few, who engage in criminal activity. Recently, a decision was taken by that arm, which is the third arm of governance. You have the legislature, you have the government, you have the judiciary, and you have separation of powers in between. You want to really deal with crime? all three have to be pulling in the same direction. Recently, we have a decision all the way up to the Court of Appeal. No, it is now possible to apply for bail when you're on a murder charge. How could you ask the government, the police service, the law-abiding citizens, the civic-minded citizens to easily accept that now persons who are charged with murder can legitimately apply for bail? Something that we've known since the Bail Act has been in place, that for the crime of murder, for capital offenses, the application for bail wasn't available. Well, that's changed now. And that is the criminal justice system. And ironically, today, in an article in the Trinidad Express, before coming to Parliament, the 25th of May today, it has happened. Murder accused gets bail. And this bothers me. It bothers me as an elected member of Parliament, as a person who's practiced in the courts for almost 2 decades before getting into politics, and as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. And it goes on, for the first time in the history of Trinidad and Tobago, a person has been granted bail for murder. It comes just over a month after the appeal court held that Section 5(1) of the Bail Act was unconstitutional, as it had removed the jurisdiction of the court to consider bail for those accused of the capital offense. And it goes on to say, and ironically, on February 17th, in a matter brought by former murder-accused Akil Charles, Chief Justice Ivor Archie, along with Justices of Appeal Miradine Armorer and Malcolm Holdip, unanimously held that Section 5(1) of the Bail Act was unconstitutional, as it breached the doctrine of separation of powers. So we as legislators can pass legislation here which we think is going to improve the criminal justice system, fight crime and criminality, pass it with a special majority, but then the concept of separation of powers is breached because there are others who think you all have no say in that. But it is the government who has the information on criminals through the police service, through the intelligence services. It is the government who is best placed to assist in the formulation of policy to deal with crime and criminality. This is a live example of us taking decisions, passing legislation in an attempt to fight crime, and then it being derailed to an extent. The issue of consequences not applying in Trinidad and Tobago is a wide-reaching one. You have it as well throughout the whole public service. You have this problem that wrongdoers, and not limited to the public service, wrongdoers, persons who commit, I mean, we have another great example of it in the last 2 days. Anybody reading newspapers in the last 24 hours would see a missing member of Parliament today saying that there's no evidence of wrongdoing when he was a minister and hundreds of millions of dollars were corruptly siphoned out. $400 million by a state enterprise spent in the space of between August 2015 and September 2015. And to then stand up and say there's no evidence, well, I'm putting it here once again on the Hansard. There is the evidence. In that particular case, there's evidence that contractors are the ones who drafted the cabinet minutes, the cabinet notes, and sent it to the minister and that ministry to put before cabinet to go with the $400 million of contracts. There's also evidence that shows text messages by that missing member of Parliament bring the check to Parliament so he could pay contractors. And what they do is they use the court system, which is part of the whole issue, and they delay it. But there is also a high court decision.
Deputy Speaker, just seeking clarification for him. Is this matter he's talking about sub judice 49? So I raised your standard of 49.1.
Again, member, I'll give you some leeway. Just be
Thank you.
considerate.
I was closing it off now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by saying there is a court decision of over 100 pages that determines there was sufficient evidence of cartel behavior and corruption. It is just to correct the record to say that there is a pursuit of corruption taking place, but again to make the example of a lack of consequences. I go on. the previous speaker, the honorable member for Siparia, who's left the chamber now, actually opened up this part of the debate. I was wondering whether to go down this road, but she opened it up frontally when she said, when the member for Siparia said a short while ago about PNM contractors and PNM encouraging criminality in the granting of contracts, and went on, ironically again, to read a Guardian article, a recent article in 2019, talking about certain corporations and the suggestion that there were criminals getting state contracts. Well, I'm disappointed that the member for Siparia isn't here to put this reminder to her and to the opposition. And I'm reading from a Guardian article dated Wednesday, October 9th, 2013. Spanish Mystery by Yvonne Babulal. And it talks about a Beetham community activist called Kenneth Spanish Rodriguez and the HDC managing director Jerlene John, a name that's familiar to us. And it goes on to say that Rodriguez featured prominently during a tour of the, I'm quoting from the Guardian article dated the 9th of October 2013. Rodriguez featured prominently during a tour of the $2 million Duncan Street Police Post project with Jerlene John, Housing Minister Dr. Rudal Munilal, National Security Minister Gary. I'll repeat it. This is Spanish Rodriguez. This is a Guardian article, and I'm directly referring, not rebutting, referring to what the member for Siparia said. So Spanish, Rodriguez featured prominently during a tour of the $2 million Duncan Street Police Post project with Jerlene John, Housing Minister Dr. Rudal Munilal, National Security Minister Gary Griffith, and Acting Commissioner of Police Stephen Williams last week Friday. Rodriguez, that is Spanish, told the media that he was the contractor for the project. He met and greeted Munilal, then the acting Prime Minister, Jerlene John, and her entourage, and escorted them to the first and second floors of the buildings.
The name
Media
that is
person
being referred to by the minister is a member of the Senate.
and I am reading an
48A.
article.
Overruled.
Thank you. You see, I am not making this up. I am not creating it. One, it is a fact that it happened, so don't come in here and once again try to mislead the population and play that somehow you're holier than thou, when the acting Prime Minister, Dr. Rudal Munilal, was being escorted in a police post project granted to a gang leader. And that's only one instance. I also used the opportunity because the member for Siparia opened it up and talked about, the exact language she used was funding the criminal elements. I want to remind this House that I was before a Joint Select Committee as the Minister of National Security and provided that Joint Select Committee with the evidence of intelligence reports with respect to members of Parliament leaving the Parliament to go to the Hyatt to pay the drinks bill for gangs and gang members. Members of Parliament for the opposition who are members of Parliament in the south of Trinidad asking gang leaders from Digo Martin to come to their constituency office. So don't come here and tell the country that you don't know about funding criminal activities. And that is the problem. Because you see, if the legislators are having these direct relationships with money involved, not even the granted of contracts, paying their drinks bill and calling them to their constituency office. If they're having those types of relationships, don't come here and tell the country that you're worried about crime because you're part of the problem. The member for Siparia, again, I have to say maybe it is that because she's reading a prepared speech, did not have put before her about the GPS system, the ankle bracelets. The member for Lavantil West as the Minister of National Security stood here in this same booth months ago and provided a report and had a press conference to say that the courts have started making the orders for the use of the GPS, the ankle bracelets. They are being utilized. So to come here and say what has happened with it, the answer is it has been implemented. There's a whole unit at National Security that are using it, that are following it, that are doing the tracking at the orders of the court. So it is happening. Again, another blatant attempt to mislead the population talking about municipal police. Yes, it was part of the PNM's plan, and it remains part of the PNM's plan in government to ensure that every corporation has 100 municipal police. And I heard this statement with my own ears from the member for Siparia saying only 300. Again, a complete untruth. There are 726 municipal police. And the only thing that stopped and prevented it from continuing was COVID. There were difficulties during the COVID period of recruiting and training. But I'm told that there's currently right now a batch of municipal police being trained. So don't come here and try and create hysteria. Don't come here and try and use the cover of crime to mislead the population, as is usual. We all know pepper spray is a great example of us as legislators passing the legislation and waiting for it to be implemented. And that is what is going on. So again, put the responsibility where the responsibility is due. PNM creates a culture of relationships with criminals. That was the quotation I took down from the member for Siparia. And you know, I'm standing here and I'm looking across the aisle and recalling those intelligence reports that call the names of persons on the other side who are in deep relationships. I heard the member for Lavantil West, and unfortunately the Minister of Public Utilities isn't here, talk about the Beatum project. Again, even up to recently, there's suggestions that the discord, the type of behavior that went on in Beatum by a small handful of people on that sewage project, and who it was on the other side that was related and encouraging the criminal behavior. So if you're encouraging the criminal behavior, don't come here and try and tell the population that nothing is being done about crime when you are actively encouraging it. Consequences and the lack of consequences, Mr. Deputy Speaker. That's the submission. And the submission is that we all have a role to play. We have a role to play as legislators. The government has a role to play in directing policy and resources, which it is doing. There was a lot of hullabaloo made by the member for Naparima and the member for Siparia about the prison system and a recent prison break. Every prison break is an unfortunate incident. And let's not fool ourselves that that only happens in Trinidad and Tobago. I remember it was in June or July of 2015, just before a massive prison break, where a police officer was killed. And that was under the Kamla Prasad Bisesa-led government. And then to stand here and talk about the Minister of National Security, in the last 7 years, under PNM administration, there have been 3 ministers of national security, myself included. In a Kamla Prasad Bisesa 5-year term, there were 6, including one who can't even leave Trinidad and Tobago to go to the United States because they're waiting for him in an international criminal ring. And let us not forget that. So the member for Siparia who has left the chamber, her response to crime was to appoint an international criminal as a Minister of National Security. And he also acted as Prime Minister. 6 members, 6 ministers of national security. And then to come here today, the hypocrisy of it, a word that seems today to suddenly have a different meaning, and say that the government has been unable to effectively prevent a surge in criminal activity resulting in rapid increases in murders, robberies, home invasions. It's insulting. It's insulting to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago standing out there. What we should be doing is working together to find ways to combat crime and the criminal element. Not having certain sitting members of parliament deep in relationships with them. Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I ask at what time my contribution ends?
Finish at 4:51.
Thank you.
4:51.
Neglected prison infrastructure. In the last 7 years, decisions were taken at national security to improve the prison infrastructure, and that has been going on. But it's been going on at a time when, unfortunately, revenue was lower and money was difficult and not as easy as it was in the past. Again, every time I go to the east of Trinidad and drive past the traffic lights, it upsets me to see a fence that was put up in 2015 for $50 million, a fence that surrounds nothing. That $50 million is exactly just a bit more we are using, and you heard Minister Hines say, to finally improve the circumstances at the remand yard in Golden Grove. And that's not to be washed aside the way Siparia did. Because I walked in the remand yard a number of times as a minister, and it disturbed me as a citizen to see the way that those inmates were being housed there. And we took a decision, and it is being implemented. The first wing has been completed to upgrade remand. As he said, there's video conferencing there now. The fencing is being improved. The CCTV cameras. The officers were provided with stab vests, with personal firearms. And what do we have? That again, a former Attorney General of the UNC goes to challenge the keep and carry for prison officers. So let the prison officers remember that it is the UNC again was put prison officers' lives in jeopardy by challenging their keep and carry policy. So when the Commissioner of Prisons is giving to prison officers who are not going to be in the prison compound, but going to come back for their shift, firearms to carry, it is the UNC who challenged that to make it insecure and to put them at risk. Right? And that is on record. That decision was given in December last year. So don't come here and try and fool the people that you're really concerned about crime. You want to be part of the solution for the reduction of crime. But every which way you look, there's an opposition element undermining the efforts to really combat crime. And then to hear the member talk about celebrating the capture of the escaped prisoners, which I don't know where that came from. But
Member, 2 more minutes.
How much, sorry?
2 more minutes.
But every civic-minded citizen had to have been relieved when the escaped prisoners were caught, and they were caught in less than 72 hours, all returned and being charged. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'll end on this point. Let us not fool ourselves that there is any one pillar, any one solution to crime and criminality. But I think the record will clearly show and reflect that those on the other side are a part of the problem and not a part of the solution. And to come here, including the leader of the opposition, to try and fool the population about, we supported this piece of legislation, and 90% of the pieces of legislation, if not 95%, that the member for Siparia quoted they supported a special majority, was because they had to, because we were about to be de-risked as Trinidad and Tobago. Consequences. And until we have the consequences of those who took the $400 million from EMBD and put it in cartels and corruption, until we have those who call in prisoners on the inside of the prison, until we have those who are paying the bar bills at Hyatt for criminals.
1 second. No, please, member, not like that. Right? Not like that. Proceed.
Thank you. They get uneasy because you see, this is the truth. This is not just the rabble-rousing and reading a speech from the back room. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to end my submission to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago through you is that until there are proper consequences for crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago, we have to be part of the problem, and it's an all of Trinidad and Tobago approach. But the UNC opposition is doing everything they can to undermine Trinidad and Tobago becoming a safer and more secure place. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I recognize the member for Shogunas West.